Part 1. The Birth of the Vampire. When you think of vampires, what comes to mind? Maybe it's the pale, glittering figures of Twilight, the leather-clad rebels of The Lost Boys, or the brooding aristocrats of Interview with the Vampire. Or perhaps it's the ancient, sharp-toothed shadow that waits at the edge of a candle's flame, the Count himself. Whatever your image, it says something about you, about your generation, and about the times you grew up in, because every era remakes the vampire in its own image. Sometimes he's a monster, sometimes he's a lover, sometimes he's both. But through every version, from the techno nightclubs of Blade to the gothic halls of Castlevania, there's always one thing that doesn't change: our fascination with the creature that refuses to die. Maybe it's because of what the vampire represents: immortality, power, beauty that never fades, and a hunger that never ends. Maybe it's because deep down we understand the longing behind it: to escape time, to conquer death, to control our own story. And yet, beyond all the cinematic fangs and Halloween masks, there's something older, something real. Because before the vampire became a myth of fiction, he was a man of flesh and blood, a man who lived, a man who ruled, and a man whose cruelty was so daggering, so deliberate, so theatrical, that centuries later, his name still drips with fear. He was called Vlad III, but history remembers him by another name: Vlad the Impaler. To understand how we got from a medieval prince to the creature of the night, we have to travel back to the 15th century, a time when Europe was divided between two worlds: the Christian kingdoms of the West and the Islamic Empire of the East. Between them lay a small, turbulent region called Wallachia, a land of mist, mountains, and blood. A land that would become modern-day Romania. It was here that Vlad was born in 1431, in the Transylvanian town of Sighișoara. It was a time when the world was burning. Joan of Arc had just been executed in France, and the Ottoman Empire was expanding relentlessly across the Balkans. Every border was a battlefield, every prince a pawn. And from birth, Vlad was caught between two unstoppable forces: Christianity and Islam, Europe and Asia, faith and empire. His father, Vlad II Dracula, was a member of an elite order of knights known as the Order of the Dragon, sworn to defend Christianity against its enemies. The title Dracula came from the Latin Draco, meaning dragon, but in the local tongue, Dracula also meant something else: the devil. And so the son of Dracula became known as Dracula, literally, son of the devil. It was an ominous name, and in time he would grow to fit it. Vlad was the middle of three brothers: Mircea the eldest, Radu the youngest. Little is known about their mother, but much is known about their childhood. It was brutal. At a time when alliances were sealed, not with trust, but with hostages, Vlad and Radu were taken from their home and delivered into the hands of the Ottoman Empire as political prisoners. They were children, 11 and 7, sent to live among their enemies. And though the Sultan treated them with a strange kind of courtesy, Vlad never forgot what it felt like to be caged. He was taught to read, to ride, to fight, and to watch. He learned the language of his captors, their customs, their strategies, and most of all, their fear. He watched how the Turks ruled through terror, how the executioner's blade could silence rebellion before it began. And somewhere in that dark, gilded cage, the boy learned the lesson that would define his life. Fear was power. His brother Radu adapted to their new world. He smiled, he charmed, he won the Sultan's favor, and earned the name Radu the Fair. But Vlad burned. He hated the Ottomans, hated their laws, their prayers, their chains. He swore that one day he would make them bleed for every day of his captivity. When he was finally released, he returned home not as a child, but as something far sharper, a weapon forged in hatred. Wallachia, the land he returned to, was chaos. Princes rose and fell with the seasons. Betrayal was currency, and the throne was a prize bought in blood. Vlad's father had been murdered, hunted through a swamp and killed on the orders of Hungarian rivals. His older brother Mircea had been buried alive, and the man who sat on the throne now was the very one who had betrayed them both. That's the world Vlad came back to, one where loyalty was a lie and survival demanded cruelty. He had no army, no allies, and no peace left inside him. But he had one advantage. Everyone underestimated him. A young exile, a forgotten prince. No one expected him to return, until he did. In 1448, with Ottoman support, Vlad struck fast. While his enemies were away fighting, he seized Wallachia's capital and claimed the throne that was rightfully his. For a moment, just a moment, he was Prince Dracula. But power for him was always fleeting. His rival returned, and Vlad was driven into exile once more. He fled north, gathering knowledge, patience, and hate. For 7 long years he waited, a shadow in the forests of Transylvania, until history gave him a second chance. In 1456, that chance came. The Ottoman Empire had crushed Constantinople and now looked north toward Europe. The Christian kingdoms trembled. Wallachia was the next domino to fall. But Vlad Dracula, the forgotten prince, saw his moment. He gathered an army of mercenaries, peasants, and exiles and marched south. He fought hand to hand with the man who had murdered his father and took his head in battle. He didn't just reclaim his throne, he avenged his bloodline. And from that day forward, no one ever underestimated him again. When he sat on the throne for the second time, Vlad looked out at a land broken by corruption, betrayal, and fear. And he decided that if fear ruled Wallachia, it would be his. The boy who once learned terror from the Ottomans now wielded it as his weapon. He began rebuilding his state the only way he knew how, through absolute, merciless control. He summoned the nobility, the boyars, to his palace for a great feast. Wine flowed, music played, and then, when the tables were full and the torches burned bright, Vlad gave his order. The doors were locked. The guards surrounded the hall. And before anyone could speak, he pointed to the guests, the same nobles who had conspired in his father's death, and said, "Traitors." What happened next would earn him his eternal name. That night, the old nobles were taken outside and impaled on long wooden stakes beyond the city walls. Their wives and servants were chained and forced to march north into the mountains, where they were worked to death, building his fortress, Poenari Castle, the seat of Vlad the Impaler. By morning, the palace courtyard was silent. By noon, the ravens had gathered. Word spread like wildfire. A prince who impaled his enemies, a ruler who ruled with terror. And in a land where betrayal was law, that terror became order. Vlad's reign had begun, not with a crown, but with a forest of stakes. A message carved in wood and blood. This is my land now. The peasants obeyed, the nobles feared, and the world began to whisper a new name, Vlad the Impaler. It said that he left a golden cup by a public fountain in his capital. Anyone could drink from it, traveler or beggar alike. But so long as Vlad ruled, no one ever dared to steal it. Because to steal in Wallachia was to die in Wallachia, he had turned fear into law, and law into legend. But his legend and his cruelty were only just beginning. Part 2. The Forest of the Impaled. When Vlad seized power for the second time, he inherited a broken kingdom. Decades of war had left Wallachia scarred, its fields burned, its people divided, and its nobles drunk on betrayal. The throne itself felt cursed. Princes rarely lasted more than 2 years before being poisoned, exiled, or slaughtered. To survive here, you had to be more than clever. You had to be terrifying. And Vlad III Dracula was. He believed that fear was the purest form of loyalty. Not gold, not love, not faith, just fear. He had learned that lesson long ago, chained in an Ottoman fortress, and now he would teach it to everyone else. He began his reign by cleansing his court of treachery. Every noble suspected of disloyalty met the stake. Every thief, liar, and schemer followed. Soon the forests around Targovishte were no longer green but red, the trees replaced by wooden poles crowned with corpses. The air itself seemed to rot. Birds circled above day and night. Wolves howled through the hills. To outsiders, Wallachia had become a nightmare. To its peasants, it was finally quiet. Vlad called this peace. Others called it madness. But Vlad's brutality wasn't senseless, it was systematic. He rebuilt his army with commoners loyal only to him, rewarding obedience with food and protection. He crushed the noble class that had betrayed his father and replaced them with men who owed everything to him. Farmers, soldiers, even freed slaves. He reforged his nation like iron in fire. And through fear, it worked. Merchants could travel without being robbed. Villagers slept with their doors open. A golden cup sat by a public fountain for years, untouched, because everyone knew what happened to thieves. It was said that you could leave a pile of gold in the middle of the road and find it still shining in the morning dew. For a while, Wallachia flourished. But terror is a poison that never stays contained. It seeps through the soil, into the roots, until even the flowers smell of blood. Dracula soon turned his gaze outward. Across the border, German-speaking Saxon merchants in Transylvania had defied his trade laws and harbored his enemies. To Vlad, this wasn't economics, it was betrayal. He rode north with fire and steel, burning their villages and impaling every merchant, magistrate, and priest he could find. Witnesses said he dined among the dying, calmly dipping his bread in their blood as the impaled twitched around him. A woodcut from the time shows him seated at a banquet table, wine in hand, while 1,000 corpses decorate the horizon behind him. It's not myth. The print still survives. The Saxons fled, spreading stories that would soon turn the Wallachian prince into Europe's most infamous monster. They described his cruelty in pamphlets, his dinners among the dying, his forests of impaled men, his feasts for the poor, where he burned the guests alive inside the hall. These accounts spread across the continent like wildfire. Within months, his name became legend. And yet, for all their horror, many of the tales were true. Vlad's rule became a theater of punishment. A messenger who refused to remove his turban out of respect for his faith had it nailed to his skull. Peasants who lied were flayed alive. Women accused of adultery were impaled outside their homes as warnings to others. He ordered the blind, the crippled, and the beggars of his realm gathered for a feast, and then burned the hall to the ground, claiming he had purified the nation of its useless mouths. To the rest of Europe, he was a demon. To his own people, he was justice made flesh, because for the first time in living memory, no Ottoman soldier marched unchallenged across Wallachia. And that, more than anything, made him a hero to the frightened Christian world. The Ottoman Empire, however, was not easily intimidated. By 1459, Sultan Mehmed II, the same ruler who had conquered Constantinople, demanded tribute from his vassal princes, gold, grain, and boys, to serve in the Janissary Corps. It was the blood tax, the same practice that had once stolen Vlad's own childhood. He refused. Instead, in the winter of 1461, he crossed the frozen Danube and invaded Ottoman territory. His soldiers burned towns, slaughtered garrisons, and left impaled corpses as mile markers for the Sultan's armies to find. In letters to neighboring rulers, Vlad bragged that he had killed over 23,000 Turks and Bulgars, counting the heads himself. He sent a message soaked in blood across half of Europe. Wallachia would bow to no empire. The response came swiftly. In the spring of 1462, Mehmed II marched north with more than 100,000 men, an army 4 times the size of Vlad's. With him rode Vlad's younger brother Radu, now loyal to the Ottomans, promising to replace the tyrant with a gentler hand. It was the ultimate betrayal. 2 brothers who had once shared a cell, now preparing to kill each other on opposite sides of a holy war. Outnumbered and surrounded, Vlad knew he could not win by strength, so he turned to fear. He ordered the wells poisoned, the crops burned, the villages emptied. Every road the Turks took was lined with impaled bodies, soldiers, peasants, animals, anything that breathed. He even sent men infected with plague into the enemy camps, disguised as deserters. Disease spread faster than arrows. The land itself became his weapon. The Sultan's army advanced through silence and rot. At night they heard whispers in the fog, the wind moaning through thousands of corpses, swinging gently on their stakes. One chronicler wrote that even seasoned warriors vomited at the smell, that the horses refused to move forward. No one had ever seen war like this. But Vlad wasn't finished. In June 1462, he launched his boldest attack yet, a night raid aimed directly at the Sultan's tent. Disguised in Turkish uniforms, he and a handful of men slipped into the Ottoman camp under cover of darkness. When the signal was given, chaos erupted. Fires ignited, swords flashed, drums thundered. 15,000 soldiers died before dawn. Vlad himself cut his way to the command pavilion, intending to kill Mehmed II and end the war in one blow. But in the confusion, he struck the wrong tent. The Sultan escaped. Even in failure, the attack terrified the Ottomans. If a man could walk into the largest army on earth and nearly assassinate its emperor, what else was he capable of? When Mehmed finally reached Targovishte, he found the city empty. The gates were open, the streets silent, and beyond them lay the most horrifying sight in medieval history. A forest, not of trees, but of men, 20,000 impaled corpses stretched for miles, the stakes swaying in the summer wind, the crows picking at what remained. The Sultan stopped his horse, covered his nose, and whispered to his generals, "What can we do against a man who commits such deeds?" He ordered a retreat. The empire that had conquered Constantinople turned back in fear of one man. Vlad had done the impossible. He had defeated an army 10 times his size with terror alone. In the chronicles of the time, even his enemies called him Dracula Voyevod, the Dragon Prince. In the villages, mothers prayed to him for protection from invaders. And in the courts of Europe, nobles whispered about the defender of the cross. The same man the pamphlets called a monster was, to many, a savior. But victory came at a cost. Wallachia lay in ruins, its fields scorched, its people starved, its nobility extinct. The land he had fought to protect was dying beneath him. And as the Ottomans withdrew, new enemies moved in, his own countrymen, tired of living in the shadow of his stakes. Within months, his brother Radu, supported by Ottoman gold, seized the throne. Vlad fled north once again, seeking aid from the King of Hungary. But kings have long memories and short patience for madmen. Instead of an army, Vlad found chains. He spent 12 years in captivity. At first he was treated as an honored guest, later as a dangerous relic. They say he passed the time by catching mice in his cell and impaling them on splinters of wood. The guards laughed nervously. No one doubted the stories anymore. When he was finally released in 1476, Europe was a different place. The wars had shifted, the borders had changed, and the world had forgotten him. But some men are not meant to fade quietly. He returned to Wallachia one last time, leading a small army to reclaim his throne. He succeeded, for a moment. Weeks later, he was ambushed and killed, struck down by an assassin disguised as a servant. His head was cut off and sent to the Sultan, displayed on a stake in Constantinople as proof that the Impaler was dead. But legends don't die so easily. They buried his body in a monastery north of Bucharest. Centuries later, when the tomb was opened, they found nothing inside. No bones, no body, only animal remains and broken pottery. The monks swore they had sealed it themselves. The villagers whispered another story, that the grave was empty because Vlad had risen, just as he promised he would. The Impaler was gone, but the fear he created lingered. And somewhere between the truth and the tales, his name began to change. From Vlad Dracula the Prince to Dracula the Monster. Because while the man was dead, the myth had just begun to live. Part 3. The Devil's Son. When Vlad the Impaler died, the world should have moved on. Wallachia was small, forgotten, and exhausted by war. His castles had crumbled, his enemies had scattered, and the people he ruled through fear now whispered prayers for peace. But history doesn't bury monsters. It resurrects them. And from the moment the stake was driven into his neck and his head hoisted on a pike above the gates of Constantinople, the story of Vlad Dracula began to change. At first, the tales came from merchants, traders from Transylvania and Saxony, who had seen his cruelty up close and needed a way to explain it. They wrote of a ruler who dined among the dying, who impaled thousands, not for justice but for joy. They described forests of corpses, fountains of blood, rivers choked with limbs. And though their stories were meant to condemn him, they did something far more powerful. They made him immortal. The printing press had just been invented, and soon, across Germany, Hungary, and Italy, Thin sheets of cheap paper began to circulate, each one covered in crude woodcuts of Vlad, sitting calmly among the impaled, cup in hand. These were the first mass-produced horror stories in human history, and at their center was the face of a man who refused to die. The pamphlets gave him many names: Dracula, the son of the dragon; Dracula, the devil's child; Vlad the Impaler. They said he boiled men alive, that he nailed turbans to skulls, that he roasted children and forced their mothers to eat them. The details grew wilder with every retelling. But one thing remained constant: the fascination. Europe couldn't look away. To the terrified peasants of the Carpathians, he was a demon who stalked the night. To the nobles of the West, he was a barbarian warning of what lay beyond their borders. And to the Romanians, who still whispered his name in prayer, he was something else entirely: a savior. Because while the rest of Europe mocked or feared him, his own people remembered that he had held the line. That when the Sultan's banners blackened the horizon and kingdoms crumbled one by one, Vlad had stood alone and said no. For them, his cruelty was a kind of justice, his madness a kind of love. He had impaled the invaders, yes, but he had also kept them out. In a land torn between empires, that was enough to make him a hero. The duality of Vlad's memory, saint or monster, began to shape the mythology around him. Priests cursed him from the pulpit. Villagers swore they saw him riding through the forests at night, his armor glinting like ice, his horse snorting mist. They said the earth would not take his body, that his grave at Snegov Monastery was empty because his soul was damned. Some claimed his heart still beat beneath the soil. Others said they had heard him whisper their names in their sleep. For centuries, travelers passing through Wallachia would hear the same warning: don't wander too close to Poenari after dark. The Impaler walks when the fog is thick. Whether they believed it or not didn't matter. The fear itself became the proof. And so legend did what death could not. It spread. In Russia, storytellers reshaped him into a figure of ruthless justice, a czar before the czars. They told tales of his wisdom, his cunning, his iron hand against corruption. Ivan the Terrible, Russia's first crowned czar, would later model his own reign after Vlad's, using terror as a political tool. He called it necessary evil. In Germany, the story warped into pure nightmare. Artists etched him into woodblocks, surrounded by mutilated victims, his smile serene as he watched them writhe. These images became early prototypes of what we now call horror. And for the first time, Europe began to see cruelty, not just as history, but as entertainment. The people couldn't get enough. The more monstrous he became, the more they wanted to read. And soon the truth of Vlad Dracula, the man, was lost under layers of rumor, imagination, and fear. By the 1600s, his legend had fused with older superstitions about the undead. Eastern Europe was full of stories about spirits that rose from their graves to torment the living. The Strigoi, the Nosferatu, the Moroi, corpses that fed on blood, spreading plague and ruin wherever they walked. When villagers found fresh blood around the mouths of the dead, the natural result of decay, they called it proof. And when they dug up those bodies pale and bloated from the gases inside, they called it resurrection. To stop the curse, they did what every fearful mind thinks to do. They staked the dead through the heart, and so, centuries before Bram Stoker would write a single word, the blueprint for the vampire myth already existed. Born not from imagination but from misunderstanding and disease. The connection between the Impaler and these old tales was easy to make. A prince named Son of the Devil, whose favorite punishment involved wooden stakes, who bathed in the blood of his enemies, who left forests of corpses to rot in the sun. It almost wrote itself. And once that association took root, it never let go. By the time the 1800s arrived, the vampire had become a fixture of European folklore, a creature of lust and death, the embodiment of everything the church warned against. Writers like Polidori and Sheridan Le Fanu gave him a face, a cape, a seductive smile. But it wasn't until one man sitting in a small room in Dublin began his research that the myth would take its final shape: Bram Stoker. In 1890, Stoker started drafting a story about an undead nobleman traveling from a dark, forgotten land to modern England, bringing with him a hunger for blood and the shadow of the old world. He called his character Count Wampir, but something about it felt wrong, too theatrical, too thin. He wanted a name that sounded ancient, dangerous, real. During his research, he stumbled upon a book about the history of Wallachia and Moldavia. In one of its pages, he found a name that caught his eye: Dracula. Next to it, a note. In Wallachian, it means devil. That was all he needed. He changed the name of his vampire, gave him a castle in the Carpathians, and rewrote the opening of his novel to describe a land where superstition lingers and the dead still walk. And just like that, the past and the myth fused forever. When Dracula was published in 1897, few realized that the name belonged to a real man. Most readers saw it as fiction, a gothic tale of horror and seduction. But for those who knew the history, there was something chilling in the details. The references to the Turks, the mention of ancient battles, the echo of a prince who once impaled armies on the plains of Wallachia. Whether Stoker knew the full story or not doesn't matter. The seed had been planted, and Vlad the Impaler, the devil's son, had been reborn as something more powerful than any king or conqueror. He had become the face of evil itself. The novel spread across Europe like the very plague it described. It inspired plays, films, art, and obsession. The vampire was no longer a corpse or a folk ghost. He was now a nobleman, intelligent and immortal, a predator hiding behind charm. The world loved him. They feared him, but they loved him. And that, perhaps, was Vlad's greatest victory. For centuries, he had wanted to be remembered, to be feared, to be known. And now, long after his body had vanished, his name had become eternal. The man who ruled with stakes became the creature killed by one. The Impaler had become the Impaled. And through that perfect, poetic inversion, the myth was sealed forever. But what makes his story endure isn't just horror, it's reflection. Because every age finds a new reason to resurrect him. In times of peace, he is a monster. In times of fear, a protector. And in times of corruption, a man who did what others wouldn't. Maybe that's why we can't let him die. Because somewhere, buried in the horror of what he did, lies something disturbingly human, a belief that the only way to stop evil is to become it. Part 4. The Count and the Curse. By the end of the 19th century, the world was changing faster than ever before. Cities rose from smoke and steel. Science promised to banish superstition. and the darkness that had once haunted Europe's villages seemed to fade under the glare of modernity. But human nature doesn't forget its shadows. And when Dracula appeared on shelves in 1897, it felt less like a new story and more like an old nightmare returning home. Bram Stoker had written more than a novel. He had resurrected something ancient. He gave it form, accent, and hunger. He took centuries of fear and myth, Vlad's cruelty, peasant folklore, the whispers of the Strigoi, and bound them into one perfect figure, the Count, aristocratic, intelligent, and immortal. A creature both refined and revolting, a mirror of the world that created him. Because Dracula wasn't just a book about blood, it was a book about control, the fear of invasion, the fear of contamination, the fear that the old world, with its brutality and mysticism, would infect the new. The same fear Vlad once embodied as he stood between East and West, between the Christian cross and the Ottoman crescent, between civilization and chaos. In Stoker's hands, that border became metaphor. The line between life and death, purity and corruption, reason and madness. When the novel was first published, it wasn't an immediate sensation, but slowly, word spread. The Gothic imagery, the howling wolves, the decaying castle, the pale figure who could pass through walls, lodged itself in the collective mind like a splinter. Readers didn't just fear the Count, they felt him, because he represented everything polite society pretended not to want: freedom from mortality, dominance, desire without restraint. And so the vampire became a cultural virus. Every adaptation mutated him a little more. In Nosferatu, 1922, he was a pestilence, a walking plague, thin and skeletal, haunting the world after war. In Dracula, 1931, he was aristocracy itself, a symbol of the upper class feeding on the working poor. By the time Interview with the Vampire arrived a century later, he had become something entirely different. Beautiful, lonely, tragic. Each generation gave him a new mask. But the bones underneath, the myth of Vlad, the shadow of the Impaler, never changed. A being who believed control was love and cruelty was order. What made Stoker's creation so powerful was not how inhuman he was, but how familiar. Because beneath the cape and the coffin lay the same logic that had ruled Wallachia centuries before. The belief that fear could preserve peace, that domination could protect the innocent, that blood, shed or consumed, was the only true bond. That's why the vampire has never gone out of fashion. He isn't just a monster, he's a reflection of the systems we build. He's the empire feeding on its colonies, the corporation draining the powerless, the ruler demanding obedience in the name of safety. He's every civilization that convinces itself that the price of order is someone else's suffering. And maybe that's why we keep inviting him in. By the 20th century, the Count had become more than a character. He was an idea. Every filmmaker, every novelist, every artist who touched his story added another layer to the curse. Christopher Lee's piercing stare, Gary Oldman's whispering menace, even the absurd parody of Count Chocula, the breakfast cereal vampire smiling from supermarket aisles, proved that the myth had become indestructible. Because once a story taps into something eternal, fear, hunger, power, it stops being fiction. It becomes folklore. And folklore doesn't die, it adapts. When the Cold War began, Dracula became a metaphor for communism. When AIDS struck, he became the embodiment of infection. In an age of billionaires and surveillance, he's become something else. An immortal elite draining the world to stay alive. Every century invents its own version of Vlad. We just call him by different names. But here's what most people forget. Bram Stoker never actually said his vampire was Vlad the Impaler. There's only one reference, a single line in the book, where a character mentions that Count Dracula fought the Turks. That's it. The rest was speculation, myth layered on myth, until truth and fiction were indistinguishable. Yet that small connection, that one historical echo, was enough to bind them forever. And in that sense, Stoker achieved something Vlad himself never could: immortality. Without a throne. It's ironic. The real man ruled by fear and died forgotten. The fictional one rules by fascination and will never die at all. In Romania, the legacy remains divided. To some, Vlad is a hero, the man who stood against the greatest empire on earth. To others, he's a curse, a stain on their history, forever linked to superstition and gore. Tourists still climb the 1,400 steps to Poenari Castle, now a ruin clinging to the cliffs above the Argeș River. They bring flowers, candles, and smartphones, hoping to catch a glimpse of something in the mist. And sometimes, when the fog curls just right, the mountains seem to whisper. Not words, but a feeling. The same dread that froze soldiers on the Danube 5 centuries ago. The same fascination that made Stoker's readers turn pages by candlelight. It's as if the land itself remembers. The man, the myth, the monster. Vlad the Impaler's story isn't just history, it's a cycle. Every generation rediscovers him, every artist revives him, and every culture uses him to say something about itself. We like to pretend that Dracula is a story about a vampire, but it's not. It's a story about us, about what we fear, what we desire, and what we become when the two meet. Because in the end, what is a vampire if not a reflection of power without restraint? A symbol of immortality without morality? A ruler who believes the world exists only to feed him? Stoker didn't create that idea. He just gave it fangs. And so the curse continued. From the forests of Wallachia to the theaters of London, from parchment to film reels to streaming screens, Vlad's shadow crept onward. Each retelling drained new meaning from the old myth, and each century left behind another victim, truth itself. Today, we see him everywhere. In politics, in media, in the mirror. The details change, the castles replaced by skyscrapers, the chalices by champagne glasses. But the hunger is the same. The endless, elegant hunger of those who mistake fear for respect. The Impaler no longer needs a throne of corpses. He has us, telling his story again and again, keeping his name alive with every whisper, every film, every click. We built him a new empire, one of memory. And that, perhaps, is the greatest impalement of all. Part 5. Blood never forgets. Centuries have passed. Empires have fallen. Kingdoms have changed names. And yet his shadow remains. Vlad the Impaler, Vlad Dracula still watches from the fog. Maybe not from a tower or a tomb, but from the stories we tell, from the fears we feed, from the way we still mistake power for order. Because history may have buried his body, but not his lesson. The stakes have changed shape. Wood replaced by walls, iron and silence. But the method is the same. Keep the people afraid and they will call you protector. Hurt them enough and they'll call it justice. That was Vlad's truth. That was his curse. And we are still living in it. They say the past never truly dies. It just waits to be remembered. In Romania, tourists climb the mountain to Poenari Castle, gasping for breath as they count the 1,400 steps to the ruins. They reach the summit, look out across the valley, and feel the wind moving through the broken towers. Some say it's just air. Others say it's him, that the Impaler still walks the walls on stormy nights, his armor clinking softly like chains, his eyes burning like embers in the dark. The locals warn visitors not to stay too late, not because of wolves, but because the mountains have memories, and some names echo louder than others. They say that sometimes when thunder rolls across the Carpathians, the sound isn't thunder at all. It's hooves. A rider still patrolling his land. A prince who refused to rest. Maybe that's the real curse of Vlad the Impaler. Not that he was damned, but that he became eternal. That his name was too powerful to die, too intoxicating to forget, because every age finds a new reason to summon him. For the peasants of Wallachia, he was vengeance. For Stoker's readers, he was temptation. For filmmakers, he was fear. And for us, he is fascination. A mirror held up to the worst parts of ourselves. We tell ourselves he was a monster, that we would never do what he did. But look closer. Look at the world, at the cruelty we justify in the name of safety, at the wars we call peacekeeping, at the hunger for control dressed up as protection. Vlad didn't invent those things. He just showed us what they look like when you stop pretending. Every century has its impalers. Some wear crowns, some wear suits, some smile from behind podiums. They don't need stakes. They have screens. They don't need swords. They have laws. And they don't drink blood. They drink attention. But the principle is the same. Feed on the living, keep them afraid, and call it order. Maybe that's why the vampire endures. Because deep down we know it's not about him. It's about us, about what we become when we forget mercy, when we trade empathy for efficiency, when we convince ourselves that cruelty is strength. We may no longer impale our enemies on stakes, but we still destroy reputations, silence dissent, erase those who threaten our comfort. The method has evolved, the impulse hasn't. That's why his story still haunts us, because it isn't just a warning, it's recognition. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world is still, think about the myth we've built. A man who believed he could bring peace through terror. A monster who became a hero. A hero who became a monster again, through the eyes of history. Vlad the Impaler ruled for 6 years, but his legend has ruled for 500. He wanted obedience and he got worship. He wanted fear and he got immortality. He wanted to be remembered. And he is. Maybe too well. If you travel far enough into the Romanian countryside, away from the cities and the tourist paths, you can find a small village near the foot of the mountains. There, under a canopy of pines, lies an old well said to have been built by Vlad's men. Its water runs cold, metallic, tasting faintly of iron. Locals say the well was cursed, that whoever drinks from it dreams of blood. They say it's his way of reminding the world that he's still here, that his hunger, his need to be remembered, still runs through the veins of the earth itself. But maybe the curse isn't in the water. Maybe it's in the way we keep telling his story, again and again, as if keeping him alive makes us feel closer to the darkness we secretly admire. Because that's the true seduction of Dracula, not his immortality, but his honesty. He doesn't pretend. He takes what he wants, does what others won't, and never apologizes for it. He is what every empire, every tyrant, every system wishes it could be: power without guilt. So yes, maybe he was a monster, maybe he was a savior, maybe he was both. But the truth is simpler and far more terrifying. Vlad the Impaler never wanted to live forever. He just wanted to matter. And he found the only way to do that was through fear. Fear lasts longer than love. It spreads faster than truth. And once it takes root, it never dies. That's why his story endures. Not because we love the vampire, but because we understand him. Because part of us still believes that to be feared is safer than to be forgotten. In the end, the line between man and monster was never as clear as we like to think. He was called the devil's son, and maybe he was, but maybe he was also just human. The most dangerous thing of all. Somewhere in the mountains of Wallachia, the wind still whispers his name. Vlad, Dracula, the Impaler. And if you listen closely enough, you might realize the echo isn't coming from the hills. It's coming from us. Because blood never forgets. Subscribe and walk deeper in the dark.